But what he does end up saying is brutal enough. He says, timing is critical. People need to act because it means their life. It means their life, whether they become Jehovah's Witnesses or not. And my question would be, why can't they be that brutal? Why can't they be that upfront when they're stood by their carts and when they're knocking on doors? Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Attic. In this video, I'll be sharing my thoughts on the 2024 Declare the Good News Convention of Jehovah's Witnesses, specifically the Friday of the convention. It is, of course, a 3-day convention, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and this video will deal with a few moments on the Friday of the convention that I found interesting. Now, I do just need to, before we begin, thank my patrons and YouTube channel members. This particular video was put as an option for being made in this month's vote. So it's being voted for now as I'm making this video in June 2024. And the response was so overwhelming for me to do a 2024 convention rebuttal that I figured I may as well get started. So huge thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members for nudging me to do this rebuttal. There isn't as much to talk about, I'm going to be completely honest, in this convention as there has been in previous conventions. In previous conventions, I would make 6 large videos to cover the entire convention, and one day would be split into 2 videos of perhaps 2 or 3 hours in length. For whatever reason, the 2024 convention, for me at least, just doesn't have quite as much to talk about, but there are still some really telling moments that I want to show you. So without further ado, let's roll the first clip.
Another reason to trust Matthew is that he personally knew Jesus. He spent much time with Jesus. Matthew was an eyewitness. He was at the scene. He was there when it happened. Matthew, a scrupulous record keeper, speaks of real people with real names who lived in real places, places that existed then and still exist on the map today. And this too makes Matthew trustworthy. And of course, there are some critics who say that the 4 Gospels contradict each other in some places. But to sincere readers, such criticism seems petty and trivial and can easily be proven wrong.
We've just been hearing from Jürgen Svensson. He's going through the symposium item, They Were Moved by Holy Spirit. This symposium goes through the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Jürgen Svensson is doing the first one on Matthew. And he's taking it very literally, isn't he? That Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, and so on. That's not how scholars approach the Gospels. And it's very telling when someone wades into Bible scholarship. You can immediately tell when they don't know what they're talking about. And so what Jürgen Svensson is doing here is he is just showing us this Bible literalist view, this kind of fundamentalist view of the Gospels. The truth is that all of the names given to the Gospels are assigned names. So in other words, no one knows who wrote Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. Those are names that were assigned to those books. So when you're reading Matthew, nowhere does the writer identify himself as Matthew. Same with the other Gospels. It's after the books were first written that they were given these names. So it's a very simplistic, presuppositionalist standpoint that Jürgen Svensson is approaching things from. And then he goes right in there and wades in on the whole topic of contradictions.
There are some critics who say that the four Gospels contradict each other in some places. But to sincere readers, such criticism seems petty and trivial.
I think it's very telling that he even felt the need to mention contradictions. He said, of course, there are those who point to contradictions in the Bible, almost admitting that, this is an issue. But the problem he has is that this is an issue that isn't going to go away. It's certainly not going to go away because he thinks that the contradictions are petty and trivial. I do actually do a video where I go into Bible contradictions in more detail, thumbnail here. And towards the end of that video, I deal exclusively with the New Testament and particularly the Gospels. Let me just give you some examples in case you're watching this as a Jehovah's Witness or a Bible fundamentalist and you're saying, Lloyd, you're speaking nonsense. You're being petty and trivial. There are no contradictions in the Gospels. Okay, well, the Gospels can't seem to agree on when Jesus was born. They can't seem to agree on who Christ's paternal grandfather was. There's disagreement on whether Jesus and Pilate had a conversation. In one gospel, they have a conversation, and in the other, barely anything gets said between them. There's contradiction as to whether Jesus was crucified before or after the Passover. That's a big deal, by the way. We're talking about when was Jesus born? When did he first emerge on our planet? And at what point did he die? And both of those details have conflicting information. So the gospel writers can't agree on whether Jesus died before or after the Passover. They can't agree at what hour of the day Jesus was crucified. They can't agree on whether the sun was up or down when Mary Magdalene visited Christ's tomb. And they can't agree on whether the women who discovered Christ's empty tomb went and told others. So these are kind of clues scattered throughout the Gospels. I mean, when you're reading one Gospel by itself, you're not going to notice this. But when you actually line them up next to each other, you're going to notice these things. So for there to be conflict between the Gospel writers, whoever they were, is actually a big deal. I think at some level, the organization understands this. Otherwise, they wouldn't have mentioned this in the convention outline to begin with.
At the beginning of chapter 3, Luke records a list of officials in authority when John the Baptist began to preach. Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, Herod, Philip, Lysanias, as well as Annas and Caiaphas, 7 in total. Now, Luke's Gospel, as stated at its outset, is fact, not fiction. So there should be historical evidence of these officials and of when they ruled. So what does history say?
Tiberius Caesar, second emperor of Rome, well attested to in literature and archaeology, as we would expect. Next, Herod Antipas, son of Herod the Great and district ruler of Galilee. Among other evidence, inscriptions bearing his name, as well as coins he commissioned, have been found. Philip, his half-brother, confirmed by historians to be the tetrarch, or territorial prince under Tiberius. Former high priest Annas and his son-in-law Caiaphas. Both are noted by ancient historians and are also associated with this family tomb by many modern historians. By setting his narrative in the context of Tiberius Caesar's 15th year in power, Luke pinpoints the start of John's ministry to 29 CE. As a result, the date of Jesus' baptism, his appearance when he became the Christ, a far superior ruler, is in a sense written in stone.
Luke was moved by the Holy Spirit to trace all things with accuracy. No wonder one scholar called him a historian of the highest order.
So Luke there, tracing all things with accuracy. We've just been watching a video that gets shown during the symposium. They were moved by Holy Spirit, again dealing with the four Gospels. This time we're focusing on Luke. I will just say that I was actually quite impressed, if I'm being as objective as I possibly can be. I was quite impressed with the quality of the documentary format videos that were interwoven throughout the Friday of the convention. We have this Scottish gentleman who is surrounded by Bibles, and we're later going to see him kind of boots on the ground in the Holy Land, going around various locations, and I was impressed. I mean, it feels like the organization is kind of upping their game a little bit by creating videos that at least give a veneer of credibility, at least appear to be a little bit more educational, rather than as in the past when they've simply had the governing body presenting information, or the governing body sat there being the talking heads in a faux documentary. This time it seems they're choosing unknown characters from Bethels around the world, and they're letting them present the information, so you don't have any kind of expectation attached to the individual. You're only really interested in what they're saying. And this particular guy, I thought, did an excellent job of, presenting information and basically taking you on a journey. Now, it just so happens that most of what he was saying is unfortunately nonsense. But nonetheless, I was impressed with the format, and it felt like a bit of a breath of fresh air. If I were watching this convention as a Jehovah's Witness, I'd be thinking, okay, that they're improving. This is way more watchable than in previous years. So marks to you there, Watchtower. Unfortunately, though, again, the information itself is quite problematic. And a great example here is where the Scottish gentleman, he is talking about how Luke traced all things with accuracy. And he's giving as an example the fact that Luke lists all of the rulers who were in power when John the Baptist began his ministry. And he's basing this off Luke chapter 3. There's just one problem. If you just go one chapter back in Luke to Luke chapter 2, you get arguably the biggest torpedo to the credibility of Luke in just the opening verses of Luke chapter 2. I've dealt with this on previous videos, but Luke chapter 2 verses 1 to 3 says, "Now in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus for all the inhabited earth to be registered. This first registration took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all the people went to be registered, each one to his own city." One small problem there. Quirinius became governor of Syria 10 years after the death of Herod the Great, who was supposed to have been ruling at the time that Jesus was born. So that's a big, big problem. That's like a massive historical anomaly in Luke. And I find it quite disingenuous that the producers of this video, I'm not going to blame it on the Scottish guy. I think he's just parroting whatever he's been given to say. But I think it's quite disingenuous for them to zero in on the next chapter and on rulers whose existence can be verified, and just skip this huge, huge problem, which very much flags the Gospel of Luke as man-made and not completely historically accurate.
I find it surprising that there are some who call themselves Bible scholars, students of the ancient writings, who doubt the authenticity of John's work. Now, this is despite the fact that the Gospel of John is found in of the very earliest works of translation.
This was a really interesting moment towards the end of the Friday morning symposium. They were moved by Holy Spirit, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We've just been hearing from Mark Lafdany from the Wallkill Bethel. He's dealing exclusively with John, and he's talking about how surprising it is to him that there are people who call themselves scholars who doubt the authenticity of John. So what he's really doing is he is bashing scholars. It does irritate me the way the organization speaks out of both sides of its mouth when it comes to the extent to which we should listen to Bible scholars. Just by way of comparison, I want to show you some clips from a very recent video put out by Jehovah's Witnesses. Again, quite a polished documentary style format that we haven't really seen in previous years, that has this kind of veneer of credibility. But in this video, they're very much bigging up Bible scholars. The video is titled, "A Lost Bible Translation Rediscovered."
This is Birmingham, once the home of renowned scientist and minister Joseph Priestley. In 1789, Priestley joined forces with a group of talented individuals to start work on a new translation of the Bible into English. For the past 200 years, this project was assumed to have failed, and all work considered lost. How was this translation different? And why was it never published? We spoke to several scholars to uncover the story of Priestley and his translation project.
We had always assumed that this translation had been lost at that point. So the finding of Garnham's New Testament translation amongst his papers, amongst our collection, was a revelation, a great surprise.
The manuscripts in the Dr. Williams Library are terribly exciting. This was a translation undertaken by real scholars who knew their Hebrew and Greek.
It's absolutely fascinating, and it needs bringing to a wider audience.
So isn't it interesting, the overall tone when it comes to Bible scholarship in just those couple of clips that we've just seen, compared to this sneering tone, this sneering dismissiveness displayed there by Mark Lafdany at the convention? You know, you can't have it both ways. Either we're going to listen to what scholars have to say about the Bible, or we're not. And bear in mind, Bible scholars devote their careers to understanding the Bible. You know, they devote decades of their lives to analyzing these texts, to understanding the history, to figuring out where the texts come from, who wrote them, you know, what were the local cultural influences going on, all of that stuff. And they have come to certain conclusions about the authenticity of certain books. And when it suits the organization to wheel in a scholar and say something that doesn't disagree with their position, they will do that. But if a scholar dares to suggest that a particular book doesn't have authenticity, or that there are contradictions between different Bible books, suddenly we shouldn't be listening to scholars.
This is a very well-preserved columbarium, or better known as a dovecote.
Different types have been found around Israel. This one is a series of man-made hollows carved into the limestone. A pair of doves were housed in each one. They were bred here. And judging by the amount of holes, raising doves was quite an industry. Why were doves in such high demand? Well, they provided meat. Their dung was harvested as fertilizer. But there was also another use.
After the birth of a child, a dove could be used as a sin offering, and a second one as the burnt offering by parents who could not afford a young ram. No wonder then, the closer we get to Jerusalem and the temple area, the more ancient dovecotes have been excavated. Directly beside the Temple Mount itself, a 1st century fragment was found bearing the word sacrifice, next to an image of 2 birds. Coins, merchants' weights, and even these shops from Jesus' era have also been excavated beside the Temple Mount. These finds led to the conclusion that these were the very streets where worshippers, even poor ones, could buy animals to offer as sacrifices to Jehovah.
This provision teaches us that Jehovah loves each one of us and that he accepts our best, even if we feel it's insignificant. Our circumstances do not define our worth to him. Jehovah values our whole-souled service, even if it's limited by age, health, or other circumstances.
So we've just been watching a video that was shown as part of the symposium, Lessons from the Land of Jesus. Yes, it's our Scottish guy again, who is presenting, again, what is, by Jehovah's Witness standards, quite a polished, impressive looking documentary that I actually quite enjoyed. I mean, again, not everything he's saying makes sense or is that impressive, but at least he's actually in Jerusalem, he's in the Holy Land, and I actually did find it quite interesting to go inside one of these ancient dovecotes. But the reason why I'm showing you this video is I think it warrants a little bit of extra thought what he's actually saying, because you can get blown away by the visuals and by this Scottish Indiana Jones character with his satchel going around, and you can think, yeah, this is a really solid foundation for my faith as one of Jehovah's Witnesses. But just think, if you are one of Jehovah's Witnesses, what the message is here. So he's gone into an ancient dovecote, and he's explaining that the buying and selling of doves was, quote, an industry. He's taking you to a part of Jerusalem where there were once shops where poor people could buy doves for sacrifice. Immediately I was thinking of the Bible account where Jesus apparently overturned the tables of the money changers because of this sort of thing, because worship was being turned into an industry. But aside from that, this got me to thinking, how is this impressive? You know, he's trying to impress us with the fact that God was giving this compromise so that poor people could worship him too. So it doesn't matter if you're poor, doesn't matter if you can't afford a ram, you can give us some doves instead. That's the sort of God that we're supposed to be impressed with. Oh, congratulations, you've had a child. I will need a sacrifice though, so do you have a ram? I'm going to need you to kill a ram for me. Congratulations, but yeah, I will be needing that ram. We don't have a ram. We got any pigeons? Yes. We've got a dove. It's going to need to be 2, I'm afraid. That is the supreme intelligence behind the creation of the universe. The supreme intelligence, the creator of all things, apparently needs doves to be slaughtered, or at some point in history needed doves or rams or whatever kind of random animal it chose, needed some kind of death to go on to celebrate a child being born or to mark a child's birth. I'm sorry, maybe it's because I've been an unbeliever for too long, but how is that impressive?
We live in critical times. Each and every one of our families is under attack. We work demanding jobs. Many of us commute to and from work, leaving us tired and exhausted with little to no energy to do anything else. For those of us in school and our young ones, to deal with peers, teachers, it can be mentally as well as physically exhausting.
So we've just been listening to Joel Owuzu from the Glenmere Lake congregation. He's not a Bethelite, apparently. He's an elder. But what an interesting little snippet there. It seems as though the Jehovah's Witness disdain for education, it just can't help but seep through, can it? They really don't like young ones learning things from anywhere other than the Jehovah's Witness organization. I think that's kind of obvious at this point, because he's talking about pressure and trials that people have to contend with, and he's just straight up listing peers, teachers.
For those of us in school and our young ones, to deal with peers, teachers.
Oh yeah, imagine having to deal with teachers. If you're a young Jehovah's Witness, how dare these teachers give us homework and teach us about stuff? I mean, if anyone were listening to this who isn't a Jehovah's Witness, I would hope they would just be scratching their heads thinking, why are teachers a bad thing? We kind of need teachers. Teachers have a hard time. They do a difficult job because they get, quite often abuse, don't they? And disrespect from children, from parents. And this is the tone that this particular speaker is using towards someone whose profession is to educate children. Maybe it's just me, but for me, it's very, very telling that rather than specify teachers who aren't doing their jobs properly, teachers who are maybe in some way toxic or overbearing or giving too much homework, he doesn't specify any of that. It's just teachers, period, that are apparently a problem for Jehovah's Witness children. And I think anyone who's spent time in the Jehovah's Witness culture will understand why it is such a huge deal. It's because the more educated Jehovah's Witness children become, particularly in the context of higher education, which Jehovah's Witnesses are heavily dissuaded from, the harder it will be for the organization to control them.
Yes, parents, make it your goal to train your children with patience and love. It strengthens your family ties. Jehovah is deeply interested in your family. How do we know? Well, please turn with me to Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4. Here we see that families are encouraged by Jehovah God. It says, and fathers, this is Ephesians 6:4, do not be irritating your children, but go on bringing them up in the discipline and admonition of Jehovah. There's no secret formula, is there? Rather, Jehovah is pleased when parents provide guidance for responsible living by doing what? Well, you notice by discipline and admonition. In other words, put the mind of Jehovah in your child.
Put the mind of Jehovah in your child. We don't want the child to have its own mind. No. We want the mind of Jehovah to be in the mind of our child. Wow, okay, so that was Grant Matheson, who is a Bethelite from Woolkill, and he is delivering part of the symposium, Lessons from the Land of Jesus, Education. We're seeing the true nature of the organization here. This is an organization that is built on child indoctrination, because let's face it, they're not doing so well with recruiting people, with recruiting grown thinking adults with basic critical thinking skills, are they? We're not seeing people queuing up at the carts wanting Bible studies. We're not hearing of people answering their doors and immediately requesting Bible studies. It's not impossible for those things to happen, but essentially for someone to be recruited into the Jehovah's Witnesses as an adult, something needs to have gone badly wrong in their lives, and they need to be emotionally vulnerable in some way, I would suggest, for them to be able to swallow the overtly manipulative Jehovah's Witness message. So in order to grow the organization, in order to gain more members, they really need to be indoctrinating children. And I just found it chilling as a father to hear a representative of this organization put it in such cold, brutal terms. We don't want children to be their own person. We don't want them to have their own mind. We want you, as Jehovah's Witness parents, to put the mind of Jehovah in your child.
Let's look at the second feature of the message we preach. That is the importance. Go back to Revelation chapter 14, if you would. Notice verse 7. Were you able to identify the key expressions that highlights the importance of the message? The angel's message is fear God and give him glory, because the hour of judgment by him has arrived. So worship Jehovah. Well, the angel's message is very direct and clear, isn't it? We are now living in the hour of judgment by God proclaimed by the angel. And did you notice that people will be judged not on the basis of whether they'll be judged on the basis of whether they fear God and give him glory. So it emphasizes to us that timing is critical. People need to act because it means their life. Now you think about that expression, fear God, it conveys the idea that Jehovah is looking for individuals that respond by change, that the truth is reaching their heart, it's transforming their lives. They begin to live by Jehovah's standards, not their own. They begin to turn away from what is bad. And they begin to give glory to Jehovah. They begin to trust him. They begin to follow the direction that he provides through his organization.
Yes, it's all about trusting Jehovah and following the direction he provides through his organization. So we've just been listening to the concluding talk on the Friday of the 2024 Declare the Good News Convention. The theme, Everlasting Good News in What Sense? And this particular speaker is a gentleman named Ryan Barber. He's actually on the US branch committee, which I guess would make him a Wallkill Bethelite. Wow, I mean, they just can't help it, can they? It's like they were doing so well in general on this day of the convention, because immediately you'll see, if you've been following my channel for a while, that I haven't had much to say on this day of the convention. Again, normally I would cover, say, the Friday of a convention in 2 videos, both of which would be like 2 or 3 hours long back in the day. That's what I was doing. And I obviously watched the entire Friday of the convention, pen in hand, you know, waiting for moments that might be of interest to my viewers. And I've only been able to come up with 7 that I actually find interesting. They've largely played it safe so far in the Friday. I haven't yet looked at the Saturday or Sunday. That's to come in future rebuttals. They've done what I would do if I were them, which is just talk about Jesus. You can't really go wrong if you're just going to talk about Jesus and uplifting, generic, themes from Jesus's ministry, but the problem they have is that they are ultimately a cult and will always be a cult, and they cannot help but show that, whether it's through demeaning, derogatory references to teachers, whether it's through talking about putting the mind of Jehovah in your child, whether it's through bashing scholars or having a double standard when it comes to Bible scholarship, or in this case, showing how doomsday they are. And what Ryan Barber has just done, in fact, it's interesting, there's one point where he kind of checks himself. He goes to say something and he kind of backtracks a little bit and rephrases. And I really would love to know what it was he was about to say, because maybe it would have been even more brutal. But what he does end up saying is brutal enough. He says, timing is critical. People need to act because it means their life. It means their life, whether they become Jehovah's Witnesses or not. And my question would be, why can't they be that brutal? Why can't they be that upfront when they're stood by their carts and when they're knocking on doors? Instead of trying to bewilder people with talk of pandas and watermelons and wouldn't you like to live in a peaceful new world, why can't they just be honest and say, you know what, we're calling at your home because your life depends on it. If you don't become one of Jehovah's Witnesses, if you don't learn to trust Jehovah and follow his organization, you're going to die. But that's it. That's everything I have for you for the Friday of this year's convention. Again, I really must thank my patrons for nudging me on this. I obviously was interested in doing it anyway, but it is a bit of work to sit through hours and hours of convention and whittle it down to, you know, the most relevant moments. So I'm happy to do it if that's what my patrons and YouTube channel members want. Thank you to them for, again, nudging me in that direction. You can look forward to a review of the Saturday and Sunday of the 2024 convention in the weeks to come. But that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching.